July 5th, 1943, 0300 a.m. The steppes of Belgorod, Russia. The air is thick with that strange, heavy silence that precedes a storm. But this isn't a force of nature. This is the agonizing wait for a man-made apocalypse. Commander Hans Müller stands tall in the cupola of his 57-ton Tiger tank, the steel beast designated number 231. The cold seeps through his parka, chilling him to the bone. But it isn't the cold that makes him shiver. It's the sheer magnitude of what is about to begin.
Kursk was the greatest tank battle in human history. The numbers are staggering. 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft, all crammed into a narrow strip of land the size of Belgium. Hitler's orders were absolute: victory at any cost.
Hans slides down into the dark, cramped belly of the tank. The interior smells of heavy engine oil, diesel fuel, and unwashed bodies. This is their home, and likely their grave. Fritz, the loader, gently slides the 88mm shells into the racks as if they were fine porcelain. Each one weighs 10 kilograms. Fritz's hands are shaking, but there is no room for error. Inside this narrow metal box, 5 men have their fates entwined. Jürgen the driver, Karl the radio operator, and Erich the gunner. No one speaks. They only hear the rhythmic sound of each other's breathing.
The crew's only faith was in the Tiger's armor. The frontal plating was 100 millimeters thick. At that time, almost no Allied weapon could penetrate it. German soldiers called it their life insurance.
But Hans knows that no insurance holds up in this hell. He peers through the visor, through the mist. He sees the dark silhouettes of hundreds of other tanks, all like sleeping giants. Seconds later, a crackling voice comes over the radio. The order they've been waiting for: Panzer Marsch. Jürgen hits the ignition. The Maybach engine coughs, rumbles, and finally roars to life. The hull of the tank shudders. Inside, the metallic thunder makes speech impossible. Headsets are donned. Hans adjusts his throat microphone and takes a deep breath. There is no turning back now. The Iron Curtain is rising. 05 a.m. The earth shakes, truly shakes. Hundreds of German tanks lined up along the horizon surge forward simultaneously. Black smoke billows from the exhaust pipes. When Hans sticks his head out of the hatch and looks around, he sees the most terrifying and magnificent sight a soldier could witness. To his left and right, as far as the eye can see, is a moving wall of steel. This is the Panzerkeil, the armored wedge.
The tactic was simple: the heavy Tigers at the tip of the spear, with lighter panzers protecting the flanks. The goal was to strike the Soviet defensive line like a sledgehammer and shatter it at a single point.
As Tiger 231 crushes the muddy soil, the vibrations ache through their bones. Erich, the gunner, presses his forehead against the rubber pad of the sight, blinking rapidly to keep sweat from stinging his eyes. And then, a whistle, a thin, shrill, and deadly whistle. The sky lights up instantly. The Soviet response is not late. Katyusha rockets, Stalin's organs, begin to vomit death upon the German armor. Explosions kick up pillars of earth around the tank. Shrapnel clangs against the Tiger's thick hide like a violent hailstorm. But they don't stop. To stop is to become a target. Through the smoke, the first silhouettes appear on the opposite ridge. Soviet T-34s, dug in, waiting in ambush. Hans screams over the radio, "Target 12 o'clock, tanks!" Distance 2,000 meters.
This distance was the Tiger's playground. The Tiger's 88mm gun could obliterate a T-34 from 2 kilometers away. The Russian tanks, however, had to close the gap to 500 meters to land an effective shot. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse.
Erich holds his breath. His finger is on the trigger. Even with the tank in motion, the German optics keep the target steady. Now the world consists only of the image inside that small lens. Hans gives the command. Fire! The 88mm gun roars. For a moment, the interior fills with cordite smoke. The shell flies across the steppes, breaking the sound barrier. Seconds later, A fireball erupts on the distant ridge. First blood has been drawn, but Hans cannot even celebrate, because behind the tank they just hit, dozens more emerge. It's as if the earth itself is giving birth to tanks. The gates of hell have swung wide open. Distance, 1,500 meters. Inside Tiger 231, the rhythm has become automatic. Fritz the loader is working in a feverish sweat. He rams a 10-kilogram shell into the breech, slams it shut, and screams, "Ready!" Hans gives the order. Erich pulls the trigger, and the empty casing hits the metal floor. Clang. This sound is like the heartbeat of the tank. But the sight Hans sees through his binoculars is where logic ends.
German tankers were in shock that day. A single Tiger could knock out 20 Russian tanks with 20 shells, but on the horizon, 50 more would appear. The Soviet strategy was simple: numerical superiority. They kept throwing tanks at the Germans until the Germans literally ran out of ammunition.
The steppe outside turns into a junkyard filled with burning T-34 wrecks. Pillars of black smoke choke the sky. But out of this graveyard, new waves emerge as if nothing had happened. Hans screams over the radio, "Ammo status!" Fritz answers breathlessly, "Armor piercing is low, Commander. Only 12 rounds left." Hans curses. Facing hundreds of tanks, they are forced to count their last remaining bullets. The distance drops below 1,000 meters. Now the muzzle flashes of the Russian tanks are visible. Russian shells begin to hammer against the Tiger's thick frontal armor. At first, just scratches, but every impact consumes more of the oxygen inside. Jürgen's hands are shaking. His visor is nearly blinded by soot and dust. The interior is like a furnace. Cordite smoke burns their throats and stings their eyes. And Hans realizes the terrifying truth. The enemy is not stopping. They are coming at full throttle. And then, the battlefield stops being a chessboard and turns into a knife fight. The Soviet tanks have closed the gap. They are now at 400 meters. At this range, armor thickness and ballistic calculations mean nothing. Whoever fires first survives. As the Tiger's massive turret struggles to rotate, the far more agile T-34s circle them, like a swarm of flies trying to bite a giant beast. An explosion. The interior rings like a bell. It's as if a giant sledgehammer has struck the hull. The ringing in their ears drowns out the noise from outside. Karl, the radio operator, screams, "Direct hit!" Fortunately, the shell doesn't penetrate, but paint flakes off the walls and light bulbs shatter. Hans sees something horrifying through the periscope. A T-34, its barrel damaged, engulfed in flames. But it's not stopping. It's driving straight at them.
The Taran, the ramming tactic. Soviet tankers who ran out of ammo or had their guns disabled used their tanks as human-guided missiles. 30 tons of steel slamming into 57 tons of steel. This meant certain death for both crews. But at Kursk, the Russians were ready to sacrifice themselves to stop the Germans.
Jürgen frantically tries to throw the tank into reverse, but it's too late. A horrific metal-on-metal scream. The T-34 slams into the Tiger's right track. The tank jolts violently, and Hans cracks his head against the turret ring. Blood trickles from his forehead into his eye. The engine coughs and dies. The lights go out. Suddenly, in the midst of the deafening roar of war, they are left vulnerable and motionless. The tap, tap, tap sounds from outside. Machine gun bullets hitting the armor sound like the Grim Reaper knocking on the door. The impact plunges the interior into pitch darkness. Only the faint, flickering red of the emergency light remains. This light only amplifies the horror within. Fritz, the loader, writhes on the floor among overturned shell racks. He has struck his head against the metal and is moaning in pain. Commander Hans wipes the blood from his forehead, but it won't stop. In that moment, they realize what this 57-ton invincible machine truly is. It isn't a fortress. It is a steel coffin, locked from the outside. Jürgen, the driver, frantically hits the ignition. The engine groans like a dying beast, but it fails to start. The noise outside changes. It is no longer the sound of artillery, but the sound of boots walking on the armor. Tap, tap, tap. It sounds like someone walking on the roof of your house. But these aren't mechanics. Hans tries to look through the periscope, but the optics are shattered. They are blind. Karl, the radio operator, flings off his headset and grabs his MP-40 submachine gun. His eyes are wide with terror. "They're on top of us! Do you hear that? They're climbing the turret!" His panic thins the remaining oxygen inside the tank.
The sound German tankers feared most was the clack of a magnetic mine attaching to the hull. These magnetic charges, known as Haftolladung, or simple Molotov cocktails, the Russians would place them on the engine grates or the edges of the turret hatch. The goal wasn't just to pierce the armor. It was to set the engine on fire or pour flaming fuel inside to force the crew out.
And then, the dreaded sound arrives. From the rear, over the engine cover, a metallic clack, followed by a muffled explosion. The tank barely shakes, but seconds later, thick, black, suffocating smoke begins to seep through the ventilation grates. The smell of burnt oil and melting rubber sears their lungs. Jürgen collapses into a coughing fit. The engine is on fire. We're burning. Hans has to make a choice. Go outside and face Soviet infantry in hand-to-hand combat, or stay inside and burn alive. Both options smell like death. The heat inside becomes unbearable within seconds. The smoke is so thick that Hans can barely see his own hand. There is no need for orders anymore. Survival instinct takes over. "Raus! Raus! Out! Out!" he screams. Fritz forgets his pain and lunges for the turret hatch handle. The lock is jammed. In a desperate struggle for life, Fritz kicks it, throwing his shoulder against the steel. With a metallic screech, the hatch swings open, and the deafening cacophony of the outside world, and fresh air bursts in. But the air isn't fresh. It reeks of cordite, blood, and burning flesh. Hans pushes the hatch open and sticks his head out. The sight before him is a scene from Dante's Inferno. The sky is choked with black smoke. The sun is nowhere to be seen. Burning tanks, mangled corpses, and scurrying soldiers are everywhere. Flames are erupting from the engine grates of number 231. Hans draws his pistol and leaps out. Fritz and Karl follow. They jump down from the hull into the muddy earth. The moment their feet hit the ground, the protected feeling of the tank vanishes completely. They are now just flesh and bone, and bullets are whistling from every direction.
Most crews had personal defense weapons, MP-40s or Luger pistols, but they were facing fully equipped Soviet infantry battalions. A tank commander entering an infantry skirmish was a scenario he wasn't trained for. Yet fueled by adrenaline and pure terror, these men fought with superhuman effort just to stay alive.
Hans takes cover behind the tracks of his burning tank, gasping for air. Jürgen didn't make it. The flames reached the front compartment too fast. Hans can hear Jürgen's screams from inside, but there is nothing he can do. That sound will haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Fritz collapses next to Hans. He's been shot in the shoulder, his uniform soaked in blood. Hans grabs his friend by the collar. Get up, Fritz!" The circle of Soviet soldiers around them is closing in. Hans checks the magazine of his pistol. 7 rounds. Hundreds of soldiers ahead. They lock eyes. The mathematics of war are over. Now, there is only fate. Suddenly, the noise stops. That horrific metallic roar, the explosions, Jürgen's screams from inside, they are replaced by a strange, ear-ringing silence. There is only the crackling of the burning engine of Tiger 231 and the sound of the wind. Hans looks at the Luger in his hand. 7 rounds. Before him, over 100 Soviet soldiers have their weapons leveled at them, the circle tightening. With a trembling hand, Hans slowly lowers his pistol into the muddy earth. This is not a surrender, it is an acceptance. The moment where mathematics ends and only fate remains. Beside him, Fritz is on the verge of losing consciousness from blood loss, leaning his head against the warm track of the tank, staring at the sky.
The end of the Battle of Kursk was, in fact, the end of Germany on the Eastern Front. Hitler hoped to regain the initiative with Operation Citadel, but the result was an absolute catastrophe. The Germans didn't just lose hundreds of tanks on the steppes of Kursk, they lost the backbone of the army, their most experienced crews. You could rebuild a Tiger tank in a factory, but you could not replace a veteran soldier like Commander Hans, who had fought for 4 years. The Soviets, however, could replace every lost tank with 3 more, and every fallen soldier with 10.
Soviet soldiers roughly pull Hans and Fritz to their feet, shoving them with the butts of their rifles. Hans turns back one last time to look at his tank, number 231. The steel fortress that had been his home for months is now a hollowed-out, blackened wreck, a grave for his friend Jürgen. Flames still flicker from the turret hatch, as if the soul of the tank is escaping into the sky. In that moment, Hans feels that he has left not just the war, but his past, his dreams, and a piece of his humanity inside that heap of metal. Evening falls. The sky darkens, and the long-awaited rain finally begins to pour, first in drops, then in a deluge. The rain douses the flames on the tanks, washes the blood off the helmets, and turns the earth into an even greater sea of mud. The battlefield is now a cemetery. For miles, there are thousands of burnt tank skeletons, twisted barrels reaching for the sky, and bodies merging with the soil. Hans and thousands of other German prisoners begin the long march into the depths of vast Russia toward the prisoner of war camps in Siberia. Most will never return.
Today, if you visit that battlefield, you can still pull rusted metal fragments, helmets, and shell casings from the ground. The earth swallowed the iron and the bone, but it could not erase the memory. Kursk remains in history as the most terrifying proof of how quickly and mercilessly technology can destroy human life.
What remains is only silence. The wind whistles through the open hatch of the burnt-out Tiger tank. Once the most feared machine in the world, it is now just a rusted monument in a field. And within that rusted metal lies the story of men who once feared, loved, and lived. A story trapped forever inside a steel coffin.